you stand in the shadow of Chaktiche Castle, the year 1610. The wind carries whispers through the crumbling stone corridors, and somewhere in the depths of this fortress, screams echo against cold walls. You are a servant, trembling as you clutch your wooden bucket, knowing that what you are about to witness will haunt you for the rest of your days. The woman they call the Blood Countess awaits in her chambers, and tonight, like so many nights before, she will perform her horrific ritual in pursuit of eternal youth. The heavy oak door creaks open, revealing a sight that defies all human decency. There she stands, Elizabeth Bathory, one of history's most notorious serial killers, preparing for another night of unspeakable horror. Her pale skin gleams in the candlelight, and her eyes hold a madness that chills your very soul. She believes that bathing in the blood of young women will preserve her beauty forever, and she has built an empire of terror to feed this delusion. Before we delve into the twisted mind of the Blood Countess and uncover the shocking truth behind her crimes, if you're fascinated by the darkest corners of history, please hit that like button and subscribe for more content like this. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these haunting tales together from all corners of the world, connected by our shared fascination with the mysteries of the past. The story of Elizabeth Bathory begins not with horror, but with privilege. Born into one of the most powerful families in Hungary, she entered the world in 1560, surrounded by wealth, influence, and opportunity. Her family controlled vast territories, commanded armies, and moved in the highest circles of European nobility. Young Elizabeth grew up in castles that rivaled royal palaces, educated by the finest tutors, and groomed to become a political asset in the complex web of 16th century aristocratic marriages. But even in her earliest years, there were signs that something was terribly wrong. Servants whispered about the child's unusual fascination with violence, her delight in watching animals suffer, and her complete lack of empathy for those beneath her station. When she was just 11 years old, Elizabeth was betrothed to Ferenc Nadasdy, a man 15 years her senior who would earn the nickname the Black Knight for his brutal military campaigns against the Ottoman Empire. The marriage, arranged when Elizabeth was still a child, was a masterpiece of political calculation. The Bathory and Nadasdy families were among the wealthiest in Hungary, and their union would create a dynasty powerful enough to challenge kings. Elizabeth spent her teenage years learning the skills she would need as a noblewoman: languages, music, literature, and most importantly, the art of commanding absolute obedience from those who served her. At 15, Elizabeth married Ferenc in a ceremony that was one of the most lavish events of the century. Thousands of guests attended, including foreign dignitaries and members of royal families. The celebration lasted for days, with elaborate feasts, theatrical performances, and displays of wealth that left observers speechless. But beneath the pageantry, those who knew the couple well noticed troubling signs. Ferenc's reputation for cruelty was well established, and Elizabeth seemed to share his taste for violence. The early years of their marriage were marked by Ferenc's frequent absences as he led military campaigns. Elizabeth found herself alone in their massive castle, with unlimited power over hundreds of servants and peasants. It was during these lonely years that her obsession with beauty and youth began to manifest in increasingly disturbing ways. She would spend hours studying her reflection, searching for any sign of aging, any imperfection that might threaten her legendary beauty. Hungarian folklore tells us that Elizabeth's descent into madness began with a single moment of violence. The story goes that one day, while having her hair styled, a young servant girl accidentally pulled too hard. In a fit of rage, Elizabeth struck the girl so violently that blood splattered across her own face and hands. When she later looked in the mirror, Elizabeth became convinced that the areas where the blood had touched her skin appeared younger and more radiant than before. Whether this story is true or merely legend, it captures the moment when Elizabeth's vanity transformed into something far more sinister. She began to believe that human blood, particularly the blood of young women, held the secret to eternal youth. This belief would drive her to commit some of the most horrific crimes in recorded history, turning her castle into a chamber of horrors that would claim the lives of hundreds of innocent victims. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Elizabeth's first experiments with blood were relatively small scale, involving the torture and murder of servant girls who had displeased her in some way. She would claim that these punishments were justified, that the servants had committed crimes deserving of death. But as her obsession grew, so did the frequency and brutality of her actions. Ferenc, when he was present, seemed to encourage his wife's increasingly violent behavior. Some historians suggest that he may have even participated in the early murders, teaching Elizabeth techniques of torture that he had learned during his military campaigns. The couple's relationship became a partnership in sadism, with each feeding off the other's cruelty and pushing the boundaries of human depravity ever further. The servants at Chactich Castle lived in constant terror. They knew that any mistake, any perceived slight, could result in a death sentence. Elizabeth developed elaborate systems of punishment that seemed designed more to satisfy her twisted desires than to maintain discipline. She would force servants to strip naked in the snow, pour freezing water over them, and watch as they slowly froze to death. She would burn them with red-hot irons, cut them with knives, and bite chunks of flesh from their faces and bodies. But these individual acts of cruelty were just the beginning. As Elizabeth's belief in the rejuvenating power of blood grew stronger, she began to develop more systematic methods of murder. She recruited accomplices among her servants, people who were so terrified of her that they would do anything to avoid becoming her next victim. These accomplices helped her lure young women to the castle, often promising them employment or better living conditions. The victims came from all walks of life. Some were servant girls from the surrounding villages. Others were minor nobility who had fallen on hard times. Elizabeth was particularly drawn to young women who were praised for their beauty, as if she believed that their youth and attractiveness would somehow transfer to her through their blood. She would examine potential victims like a farmer inspecting livestock, looking for the perfect specimens to feed her horrific addiction. The process of murder became ritualized, almost ceremonial in its precision. Elizabeth would have her victims brought to specially prepared chambers in the castle's deepest dungeons. These rooms were equipped with every instrument of torture imaginable: iron maidens, racks, branding irons, and countless knives and blades. The walls were stained with blood, and the air was thick with the smell of death and decay. Elizabeth's method of bathing in blood was as elaborate as it was horrifying. She would have her victims suspended from the ceiling, their bodies pierced with sharp instruments, so that their blood would drain slowly into specially prepared tubs. She believed that the fresher the blood, the more powerful its rejuvenating properties, so she would often climb into these tubs while her victims were still alive, still bleeding, still screaming. The Countess would immerse herself completely in the blood, rubbing it into her skin like a precious ointment. She would drink it, believing that consuming the blood would work from within as well as without. Her accomplices would massage the blood into her face and body, and she would lie in these crimson baths for hours, convinced that she was absorbing the youth and vitality of her victims. As the years passed, Elizabeth's crimes became more frequent and more brutal. She was no longer satisfied with simple murder. She needed increasingly elaborate forms of torture to achieve the same satisfaction. She would force victims to mutilate themselves, would burn them with candles and torches, would tear at their flesh with her own teeth and nails. The castle became a factory of death, processing a steady stream of young women to feed Elizabeth's insatiable hunger for blood. The local population began to notice the disappearances. Families would send their daughters to work at the castle, only to never see them again. Elizabeth would claim that the girls had run away, or had been dismissed for theft, or had died of natural causes, but as the number of missing women grew, so did the suspicions of the local authorities. Ference's death in 1604 removed the last restraint on Elizabeth's behaviour. Without her husband's protection and influence, she should have been more vulnerable to investigation. Instead, she seemed to interpret his death as a sign that she needed to intensify her efforts to preserve her youth. The frequency of murders increased dramatically, and Elizabeth began to target women from higher social classes, believing that noble blood would be more effective than peasant blood. This decision would prove to be her downfall. When daughters of minor nobility began disappearing, their families had the resources and connections to demand investigations. Unlike the peasant families who had lost their daughters, these nobles could not be ignored or intimidated into silence. They began to press for answers, and slowly the truth about what was happening at Chaktich Castle began to emerge. But Elizabeth remained convinced that her methods were working. She would spend hours examining her reflection, searching for evidence that the bloodbaths were preserving her beauty. She believed that she had discovered the secret that had eluded alchemists and philosophers for centuries, the key to eternal youth and immortality. In her twisted mind, the hundreds of lives she had taken were a small price to pay for such a magnificent discovery. The investigation that would eventually bring down the Blood Countess was already beginning, though Elizabeth remained unaware of the net closing around her. Local officials were gathering testimony from survivors, documenting the disappearances, and building a case that would shock all of Europe. The woman who believed she had found the secret to eternal life was about to discover that some crimes are too heinous to escape justice, even for the most powerful nobles. The first witness to come forward was a young woman named Susanna, barely 17 years old, who had somehow escaped from the castle's dungeons. Her testimony would become the cornerstone of the investigation that would finally bring Elizabeth Bathory to justice. Susanna's hands shook as she described what she had witnessed in those blood-soaked chambers, her voice barely above a whisper as she recounted the screams of her fellow prisoners, the smell of death that permeated every stone of the castle. She told investigators about the night she was supposed to die, how she had been dragged from her cell and brought before the Countess. Elizabeth had been preparing for another bloodbath, examining Susanna's young face with the calculating gaze of a predator. But something had gone wrong that night. A commotion in another part of the castle had drawn Elizabeth away, and in the chaos, Susanna had managed to escape through a servant's passage that led to the outer walls. The authorities initially struggled to believe such fantastic claims. How could a woman of noble birth, a member of one of Hungary's most prestigious families, commit such unthinkable atrocities? But as more witnesses came forward, as more evidence was uncovered, the horrifying truth became undeniable. Servants who had fled the castle told stories of rooms ankle-deep in blood, of instruments of torture that defied imagination, of the Countess herself covered in gore, laughing as she bathed in the life essence of her victims. King Matthias II of Hungary could no longer ignore the mounting evidence. The political implications were staggering. Elizabeth Bathory was not just any noble, she was connected to some of the most powerful families in Europe. Her crimes threatened to destabilize the entire social order, to shatter the illusion that nobility equated to virtue and honor. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the king had no choice but to authorize a full investigation. The man chosen to lead this investigation was György Thurzó, the Palatine of Hungary, and one of the most trusted officials in the kingdom. Thurzo was a careful, methodical man who understood the delicate nature of his mission. He would need to gather irrefutable evidence, build a case so solid that even Elizabeth's powerful family connections could not save her. The investigation would take months, but Thurzo was determined to see justice done. Meanwhile, Elizabeth continued her gruesome rituals, unaware that her world was about to come crashing down. She had grown careless in her confidence, no longer bothering to dispose of bodies properly or to silence potential witnesses. The castle's dungeons were filled with evidence of her crimes. Torture devices still stained with blood, rooms where the walls themselves seemed to weep crimson tears, and the remains of countless victims who had been deemed unworthy of proper burial. The Countess had also begun to document her crimes in a twisted form of record-keeping. She maintained detailed journals describing her methods, her beliefs about the rejuvenating properties of different types of blood, and her plans for future experiments. These journals, written in her own hand, would become some of the most damning evidence against her. They revealed not just the extent of her crimes, but the calculated, methodical nature of her madness. On December 30th, 1610, Gheorghe Thurzo and his men surrounded Chaktiche Castle. They moved under cover of darkness, knowing that Elizabeth's accomplices might try to destroy evidence if they were given warning. The raid was swift and decisive. Thurzo's men found the castle exactly as the witnesses had described. A charnel house where human life had been reduced to nothing more than a source of blood for the Countess's deranged rituals. In the dungeons, they discovered girls who were still alive, chained to walls, their bodies bearing the marks of recent torture. Some were so weak from blood loss that they could barely speak. Others had been driven mad by their experiences, their minds shattered by the horrors they had witnessed and endured. The investigators found torture chambers equipped with devices that seemed designed by the devil himself, rooms where the very air seemed poisoned by the suffering that had taken place within their walls. Elizabeth herself was found in her chambers, seemingly unconcerned by the commotion around her. She was preparing for another bloodbath, calmly instructing her servants on the proper temperature for the crimson liquid that filled her marble tub. When Thurzo confronted her, she showed no remorse, no recognition that she had done anything wrong. In her twisted mind, she was pursuing a noble goal, seeking to preserve her beauty and youth through methods that were simply more advanced than those understood by common people. The trial that followed was unlike anything Europe had ever seen. For the first time in memory, a member of the highest nobility was being held accountable for crimes against common people. The evidence presented was so horrific that many of the court officials became physically ill during the proceedings. Witness after witness testified to the Countess's cruelty, describing scenes that seemed to come from the deepest circles of hell, rather than from a nobleman's castle. Elizabeth's accomplices were also brought to trial, and their testimonies provided even more damning evidence. They described how the Countess had recruited them through a combination of bribes and threats, how she had gradually drawn them into her web of murder and torture. Some had tried to refuse, only to be told that they would become the next victims if they did not cooperate. Others had been corrupted by the promise of wealth and power, becoming willing participants in the Countess's reign of terror. The trial revealed that Elizabeth had murdered at least 80 young women, though some estimates placed the number much higher. Her own journals suggested that she had killed more than 650 victims over the course of her murderous career. The scope of her crimes was almost incomprehensible, representing one of the most extensive serial killing sprees in recorded history. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the trial was Elizabeth's complete lack of remorse. She maintained that her actions were justified, that she had been conducting important research into the nature of youth and beauty. She spoke of her victims as if they were laboratory animals, necessary sacrifices in pursuit of a greater scientific understanding. Her inability to recognize the humanity of her victims, to feel any empathy for their suffering, revealed the depths of her psychological disorder, the court faced an unprecedented dilemma. Elizabeth's crimes clearly warranted the death penalty, but her noble status complicated matters. Executing a member of such a prominent family could have serious political ramifications, potentially destabilizing relationships between Hungary and other European powers. After much deliberation, the court reached a compromise that would satisfy the demands of justice while avoiding the political chaos that might result from executing a countess. Elizabeth Bathory was sentenced to life imprisonment, but not in any ordinary prison. She would be walled up alive in her own castle, confined to a set of rooms with no windows and only small slots through which food could be passed. She would spend the rest of her days in the darkness, cut off from the world, unable to harm anyone else. It was a fate that many considered worse than death, a living tomb for a woman who had turned her home into a slaughterhouse. The sentence was carried out immediately. Masons sealed Elizabeth into her chambers, leaving her with only the most basic necessities for survival. She would never again see sunlight, never again feel the wind on her face, never again have the opportunity to spill innocent blood in pursuit of her twisted dreams of eternal youth. The woman who had believed she could cheat death through the murder of others would spend her final years contemplating her own mortality in the deepest darkness. Elizabeth Bathory died in 1614, 4 years after her imprisonment began. She was found in her cell, her body bearing no signs of violence or illness. Some said she had simply willed herself to die, finally recognizing the futility of her quest for immortality. Others believed that the isolation and darkness had driven her completely mad, that she had died from the weight of her own tortured conscience. The Blood Countess's story serves as a chilling reminder of what can happen when wealth and power are combined with mental illness and moral corruption. Her crimes shocked Europe and changed the way society viewed the relationship between nobility and accountability. No longer could the powerful assume that their status would protect them from justice, no matter how heinous their crimes. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Elizabeth Bathory's legacy is what it reveals about the human capacity for evil. Her belief that she could preserve her youth through the blood of innocence speaks to a narcissism so profound that it obliterated any sense of human compassion. She transformed her castle into a temple of death, worshipping at the altar of her own vanity, while hundreds of young women paid the ultimate price for her delusions. The ruins of Chakteach Castle still stand today, a monument to one of history's most horrific crimes. Visitors report an atmosphere of oppression and dread, as if the stones themselves remember the screams that once echoed through these halls. The Blood Countess may be long dead, but her story continues to haunt us, a reminder that the pursuit of eternal youth can lead to the most mortal of sins.